Welcome to Inside New York's Art World. I am Barbara Lee Diamonstein, and our guest today is as much a myth as some of the artists he has represented. He is a novelist, lecturer in art history, and adventuresome tastemaker. Always in the vanguard before it became a bourgeois pursuit, he was also a high school dropout. It's a pleasure to welcome Ivan Karp, the director of the O.K. Harris Gallery in Soho. How did you end up being a vanguard dealer, an eclectic collector? Your collections range from everything from Americana to 19th century paintings to saltware to American tools, memorabilia. How did that all happen?
Well, there were no qualifying exams for being an art dealer, as there would be operating a motor vehicle. So that anybody who has a notion to open a clean white space with a couple of plants and a chair is an art dealer. Put some works up on the wall, and you seek community prestige. There's a certain luster that goes with this occupation, apparently. People give it a certain amount of respect. And if you feel that you have perceptions and taste, you can open a gallery. So as far as that goes, there's really no challenge in doing it, except if you have the funds wherewithal to embark on it, or to find a friendly backer. My sequence of events is more elaborate than that. My involvement with the arts is ancient in my history. It goes back to my early years, when my father took me out of his sound instinct to the Brooklyn Museum to listen to a band concert every Sunday afternoon. And beginning at the age of 4 or 5 years old, we went every Sunday punctually at 3 o'clock into this large marbleized chamber, listened to the band concert. We listened to Rossini, brasses. In a marble room, the sound is rather vibrant. And at one session, I discovered that I needed to rise during the interval and wandered about the space and located objects, saw objects there that had nothing to do with the concert. Finally discovered that actually it was a museum of fine art in which concerts were held, not a concert hall. From then on, I got more elaborately involved in visual experience. I also discovered that among my friends, that I was distracted by sights and scenes and spectacles and by objects and official works of art, more so than they. I began to feel alienated and strange and slightly eccentric. And so I sought out those like myself. And I found others. In New York, you find any kind of eccentricity. Found others who shared my sensory passions. And I traveled about, after I came out of the army, in Europe looking at paintings, sculpture. There were always reproductions around my house. I remember the New York Post, when it was in a state of even greater agony than it is now, 1934, 1935, in order to increase its circulation, offered reproductions of famous artists like Thomas Hart Benton, Luigi Lucioni, and Van Gogh. Very few have ever heard of Luigi Lucioni, but he was very popular in 1934, and I see a couple of sly smiles out there among the 2 or 3 people who might know his name. He painted very fat tree trunks. So the paintings, the reproductions of pictures around the house, we didn't have any original works of art. And I had gone to Europe fortuitously after I got out of the army on my army bonus. I lived on $1 a day for a year in France, and I got to see a lot of fine works of art. I wandered aimlessly after that period for about 10 years, until somebody said, listen, you have a fairly agile mind, Karp. I mean, look, probably have some writing skills. Why don't you write for this little newspaper that's just coming out? They're looking for an art critic. They don't pay you anything. Maybe you have to pay them to get your name in the print, but they might be able to use your services. So I wrote art criticism in 1955. I was the first art critic for the Village Voice. But the art critic was obliged also to cover film, dance, theater, and other extravagances. So I wrote on all subjects during that time. But my greatest passion was for the visual arts. And I stumbled about the various galleries in the city that I was assigned to by the editor, who knew nothing about the art world at all. That's why sessions like this, of course, are advantageous. At that time, there was no such preparation for a fresh young mind. And I went around to these obscure galleries and found myself in one where there was a charming young man who said, "I read a review you wrote about our gallery, and it was most incisive."
Is that Hansa Gallery?
That was Richard Bellamy. And most incisive, he meant, of course, that I had been complimentary to the artist's work. And he invited me to share with him the time that he gave to this space. It was a little gallery.
Is that a cooperative gallery?
It was a co-op. It was one of the early co-ops, the Hansa Gallery on Central Park South. I see somebody in the audience who actually visited that place. In fact, there's somebody in the audience who knows so much about the art world that I feel that anything I can say here could be brutally challenged.
Who is that
But I won't
person?
reveal who he is.
Oh, I feel certain he will sooner or later.
No, he won't. So I joined this gallery, and we worked 3 days a week, each of us, and the compensation was $12 each, plus 10% commission if you sold anything, but we showed very peculiar things in those days. People like, who was it, Richard Stankiewicz, and George Siegel, and Jan Müller, and other artists who come to some measure of fame. People, Lucas Samaras we showed, John
Was that
Chamberlain.
Lucas's first
Well, he showed there with us. He was an invited artist. He didn't want to join co-op because the co-op's dues were $8 a month, and he didn't have it. So we showed him as an invitational. Lucas Samaras and John Chamberlain and Alfred Leslie were all shown in that gallery, but we didn't really gain anything in the way of fame or prosperity. And so after 2 years, the gallery developed a condition known as an excess of democracy. That's what happens in co-ops, where the artists, of course, all had very strong voice in the management of the gallery and the selection of the talent. So there's a great deal of internal turmoil. The gallery fell to pieces, and it decided that I was too vibrant and strong and aggressive a personality to suit such a democratic institution. So I was issued forth again into the wretched world.
And you wended your way east.
No, but just before that, a sly, dapper young man, not so young, came to see me and said, "Hey, Karp, you talk about pictures like you really got involved in them, you know?" He said, "There's a gallery uptown, a ritzy gallery that'd like to use your services." And this was Martha Jackson Gallery, and one of her artists used to come to the shows. They're one of the 9 people a week who used to come into this place. And he asked me to come visit with Mrs. Jackson, and we had a conversation, and she decided that I was very agile-minded and clever, and that I might be able to serve her situation there.
During the course of the time that you were at Martha Jackson's gallery, was there a new media exhibition that was considered some breakthrough exhibition?
That exhibition took place just after I left her. I handed her, with all my pleasure and happiness, a man named Richard Bellamy, who had worked with me at the Hansa Gallery. The Hansa Gallery finally suffered final demise. You know, it went bankrupt. And Mr. Bellamy was without work. And shortly after I left the Jackson Gallery, that was only for a 9-month period that I was there, I offered her Richard Bellamy, a national prize. And he helped, with myself, of course, instigate some of the more adventurous shows that she had. There was Oldenburg and Dine and some other marvelous artists.
Was the store first shown at Martha?
No, the store was shown on a side street on the Lower East Side. Oldenburg rented a little space, and he showed his wonderful plaster objects. At that time, each had prices on them as if they were fruits and vegetables. Prices like $29.35, $17.36, and he was very cautious to actually get the amounts made out to those particular prices. He wouldn't give any discount or add anything to it. You know, the show sold 4 or 5 pieces out of 50, I remember.
You brought us very quickly up to about 1959.
That's right.
And after that brief period at the Hansa Gallery and at Martha Jackson, you went to work for, I guess, the master. And what I am leading to is that you wended your way to another gallery.
Well, before wending, I wanted just to insert the instance of the seduction. A little man, again another little man, these little men are all seducers, delicate, fragile little man, not more than 84 pounds, came into me and said, "Listen, Karp, I heard you give that lecture on Tapias." He was one of that crowd. And he said, "You spoke with such conviction, with such overwhelming passion, that I've never seen anybody so involved with anything." He said, "We could use you because we're starting a new gallery uptown, and there's somebody up there that needs you. And you probably know his name." And he said, "Leo Castelli." Castelli had gone into business just the year before, and in his first shows there was Jasper Johns and Rauschenberg, the first shows he'd had. And all of us in the inside track of the art world were very much responsive to that show, and of course we honored this new dealer who was brave enough to show the work of these 2 artists, and so we paid homage to him for having achieved that. And they invited me to lunch at the first haute cuisine restaurant I'd ever been in.
Where was that?
Terrible lunch, but it was a lovely restaurant.
Where
it's
was
that
it?
hotel up on Madison Avenue, 77th Street. You know, the Carlisle. The breakfast, lunch, the price of lunch was unsettling to me because I managed to glance at it. But I went out that day because I knew they were going to ask me to work there, and I knew that my salary would be larger than it had been up to that point. I went and bought a suit at Brooks Brothers. in the ready-to-wear shop, and it was $100 for the suit. And I still have the suit. That's 1959, and it hangs there in splendor as a memorial to my
rites of
first
passage.
incursion into the art world. Anyhow, we had a lovely lunch, and they invited me to join the Castelli Gallery, which I promptly did.
During the course of the time that you were there were a group of artists that were both discovered and developed and promoted to international prominence. You were very deeply involved in that enterprise, and I think that period certainly not only set a whole new aesthetic standard, but new boundaries for art. I wonder if you would take some time and reminisce with us about that period, especially for the decade that you were there, from 1959 to 1969. Perhaps you might mention some specific artists. In fact, why don't I start by asking you a specific question? And Leo says that your version of how Roy Lichtenstein first came to the gallery differs from his, but we'd like to hear your version of those.
There's no question that my version is the accurate one, because
of those events.
Leo was notoriously absent-minded, and he was also notoriously absent from the gallery at times. Lichtenstein came to me through Alan Kaprow. Alan Kaprow had shown with us at the Hansa Gallery. He was teaching with Roy Lichtenstein out at Douglas College, which is an adjunct of Rutgers. And he said that there was a young man working out there who was doing strange, peculiar, impossible pictures. And that I had the reputation of being generous about looking at artists' work, and would I look at his work. I said, of course, he could come in with his slides and photographs as everybody else did, and I'd be pleased to look at them, and if I liked them, I would show them to Castelli, which was our practice already at that point. He said he didn't have any slides, he couldn't afford them, he would bring the paintings themselves in on the top of his car. I was teaching then at a place called, now defunct, Finch College. I taught once a week a course called Disruptive Elements in the Art World. It was the official title. Actually, it was the students who were disruptive. They were totally distracted from the course of culture. And I made powerful lectures there, but nothing came of it. Anyhow, I brought the young women to the Castelli Gallery as part of the sequence of events of the Art Since 1945 situation. And the young artist Lichtenstein, I expected, was standing on top of the stairs with 4 pictures, which he could hardly contain from falling down the stairs. And I said to the young women, since the artist looked a little bit distraught at this surge of womankind coming up the stairs, would they not enter the exhibit and give me a report on their feelings about it while I talked to this artist? And I said, what have you got there? Why did you bring all these giant pictures, 4 enormous paintings? And he said, I don't have slides. So I brought the paintings themselves. I said, this is not usual practice. Castelli gets upset even if the floor creaks when you walk in, you know. He's going to be terribly distressed to see these 4 pictures walking in unsolicited. I said, sneak them into this area. There was a little hallway there, and we took them downstairs, and I saw 4 enormous, aggressive, ferocious, brilliant cartoons. And I remember my own vivid reaction. I said, I'm not sure that you're allowed to make pictures like this. And I got very involved in his reaction to my reaction, you know, when we developed a conversation. I said, look, these pictures are peculiar, they're strange, they're even downright dangerous. I said, you leave one here in the racks, that one. This picture of a man sitting in a rocket ship saying something.
And one of those balloon encased captions.
Balloon, yes. I said, I'll put this in the racks, and I will sneak it out when Castelli comes back from one of his 3-hour lunches and show it to him. And that's how it began. And curiously enough, and it was consistently the case, Castelli was responsive to it. And he said to me, I'm not sure he's allowed to do that. It's just the same reaction I had. It was very brash painting. It was brutal. It was cartoons, you know. And that is the accurate, sequential event of the arrival of Lichtenstein at the Castelli Gallery.
Actually, his very closely approximates
yours. Well, he used to
yours.
listen to me tell it.
That's why you told it that often. Did you ever expect the media to proclaim the movement, the pop art movement, the way it did?
Yeah, I objected to that appellation. And it was not properly described because, given as it was by Alloway to a certain kind of art that was generated in England, it really didn't apply to what was happening in New York at that time. But for want of something else, it was picked up by the fashion press. And it circulated very rapidly so that the titles and appellations we had planned for it never ripened.
What did you have in mind?
Well, no, they're under the bridge now.
Well, tell us anyway what might have been.
A little later on. I want to give you some reaction to the situation that you described, the early years of Castelli instead.
All right.
At that particular juncture, the gallery was not extensively known except for these two shows, because Rauschenberg was known in the art world as an enfant terrible. He was doing difficult textural works.
1957 and
58 works, yeah, were full of rough textures and found materials. And they were, of course, brilliantly organized and exquisite compositions that they discovered to be now. That time they seemed rather unsettled and bohemian. And so there was really no general buying public for his art at that point. But John sold out his first show at prices, I'm sorry to say, between $75 and $250 for major works. It was whispered to me the other day that a painting of John's had sold for $780,000. And this was a painting from his first show. So these things happen not on a regular basis. For those of you who are going into the art business, this is not a regular occurrence.
And those of you who are artists, please bear in mind how he participated in that $780,000.
In the Castelli Gallery, which at that time had just been rebuilt, it was on the third floor originally, fourth floor, moved down to the second floor. It seemed at that point to me the largest gallery space I had ever seen. It was 25 by 25 feet.
This is 77th
That was very large
Street.
for New York art world at that time. That was
4
a big
East
space.
77th Street?
That's 4 East 77th Street, which still functions as a print and photography gallery. 25 by 25 feet, and we said, how will we ever fill a space like this? Anyhow, Castelli occupied an elegant little room in the back, his office, and I sat in a room closer to the front, and I received all the people that came in and sorted them out. I knew who his friends were, and they were my friends as well. We had, from the very beginning, a warm, amiable, affectionate relationship, which we still have. I don't think there was ever really a dark moment between us. It was perfect unity about how the gallery should function, about how artists should be looked at, how they should be considered, how people should be treated. And that was with kindness, with generosity, with all the time and energy that we had. And he always gave that, and that's why he's not as strong as he used to be. Nobody's ever given more of his dedication and emotion to artists and to collectors than Castelli himself. A man of such good nature and such compassion that he's frequently trampled upon. His reputation as a fierce, elegant, and ferocious character is, of course, a complete falsehood. This is a delicate, lovely, generous man who's been much trampled upon, as I say. The process there of looking at work was that we looked at everything. That was my own instinct. That's why I came there. And Castelli had the same open attitude. But he didn't have quite the strength to receive all of the applicants. So I would sort them out. And we saw at that time about 8, 10, 12, 15 artists a day came in with their slides. And those that looked interesting to me, I kept the slides, or I kept notations of their address. And at the end of the week, usually on Saturday morning, which was a very quiet time, we would go down to the various neighborhoods where the artist lofts were. At that time, it was beginning already to be Soho. Artists started to move into that district about 1960, 1961. But also Chelsea was a very lively area. So we'd visit the studios, and if we both felt that the artist was of merit, then we would organize an exhibition, or put the artist in a group show, or have a couple of works for the back room. But that was the process whereby artists were assembled for the Castelli Gallery. And with the gallery at that point were already Paul Brock, who's now showing, in fact, there's an opening this week on Madison Avenue, Marisol, Salvatore Scarpita, Norman Bloom, if I can remember correctly, and several others. But the
Cy Twombly there yet?
No, he wasn't. And that was our fondest wish and dream, was to acquire Twombly, who was hardly known at that point. In fact, Twombly at that time had one show at the Stable Gallery, which was located in an old stable on 56th Street, just off on 7th Avenue and 56th Street, and it still had the curious presence of hay and horses about it. Anyhow, they showed Twombly there. That was the image that entered my soul more succinctly than any other American art, more than Johns and Rauschenberg, was Twombly, and it still hovers there with the same force and power.
Yeah.
And, so he was the artist that I most wanted to acquire for the gallery. It took a certain amount of diplomacy to do that.
How did that eventually take place?
Rauschenberg acquired him for us.
Because of their close friendship?
Yes, they had occupied, Johns, Rauschenberg, and Twombly occupied the same building down on Front Street for several years during their formative artistic careers. And Rauschenberg said that we welcomed Twombly into the gallery. He told him that, so we got Twombly that way.
And how did Oldenburg and Dine accede to the gallery?
No, Dine was never in the gallery. Dine went to Zonnebend when she formulated her gallery, and then he went to the Pace Gallery. He never came in. But Oldenburg was just really affiliated a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. He was with the gallery on a commission basis of some very special arrangement about 3 years ago, but he's only been with the gallery 2 or 3 years now. I think it's that.
And Warhol?
The Warhol story is a more elaborate one. Warhol came into the gallery in 1961 with 2 friends and asking to look at the works of this artist Jasper Johns. He wanted to acquire a drawing. We took out the 4 or 5 drawings that we had. There was a drawing of a light bulb about 4 by 5 inches. It was $275. He asked for a discount. And we adjusted it 10% downward. And
He was
with
in a
Warhol buying the
fashion
book.
magazine
He was doing shoe illustrations for fashion
Harper's
magazine.
Bazaar.
He didn't tell me that at that moment. I said to him, do you want to see another peculiar artist, more peculiar than this man Jasper Johns that just came in? And I took out that one painting by Roy Lichtenstein that we had there of this man sitting in the rocket ship issuing a classical cartoon phrase. And this very strange-looking man with the close-cropped gray hair and very odd complexion reacted most vividly in saying that this was an astonishing picture he was looking at, in that he was doing works of the very same kind in his studio. I said, what do you mean? You're doing pictures in the cartoon style? He said, exactly, the cartoon style with bright, vivid colors, and would I not come visit his studio? Well, I already felt the intimations of a major art movement, and I went to visit Warhol Studio, which was on 89th Street and Lexington Avenue, which is still his residence. It was a powder blue building next to the Karen Horney Clinic, and the juxtaposition has a certain resonance about it. And the house, when I came in, and this was about 10 o'clock in the morning, I imagined he'd probably just gotten up in anticipation of my visit. He was wearing a theatrical mask on his face, and there was very, very loud music playing. A rock and roll song, and I remember the name of the song. I don't know if many of you will know it. It was by Dickie Lee, a song called I Saw Linda Yesterday. A song always stayed with me, and I can sing it for you in another session, and they invite me back here.
I might tell you that Mr. Karp's novel is entitled Dooby Doo.
Well, I was very, very powerfully affected by the rock and roll movement, as many people were in its early phases, during its ripe, beautiful years. And he played this record as loud as possible, continuously, during the entire time that I was there. And I asked him why he played it over and over again. There was other good music to listen to, and I suggested any one of 8 or 10 groups that were just as good as Dickie Lee. He said, I really don't think I'll understand what this all means except if I hear it for 8 hours.
Is that the explanation of his films?
The explanation of his films and everything, all his repetitions. The idea is you can't understand it until you're bludgeoned by it. Right. Anyhow, there was a beautiful Victorian apartment with fabulous trappings and furniture and lamps and all kinds of exquisite art objects. And in the corner were 15 paintings. And they were in 2 categories. One had cartoons with drips, and ones were cartoons without drips. And I was already, from this one Lichtenstein painting that we had at the gallery, I was already the leading authority on this school of painting. So I said, you do these fine, fresh, bright, bold, brutal cartoons, why do you put drips in these? And he said, don't you like the drips? I said, well, it doesn't seem important for pictures like this to drip. He says, but you know, the prevailing tendency in art is to be spontaneous, you know, and abstract expressionism is also about spontaneity and dripping, and nobody's going to accept my art unless it drips. So I said, let's try the frontal approach and just show the pictures that don't drip. He said, well, you do anything you want. You're the guide to my career, he said. He announced to me at that point. Well, I found the work, of course, brash and raw and beautiful, already having been instructed by Lichtenstein. And I had Castelli down, and he said, well, if we're going to show this man Lichtenstein, which I dare not do, we can't show this one also because there's going to be competition between them, so we'll have to find another place to show. So during that interval, I invited 8 or 10 other art dealers down, and they found both the studio, the apartment, the furniture, the paintings, and the artist obnoxious. And so Warhol, for 2 years, could not acquire an exhibition. But in the meantime...
Was he as reticent and withdrawn in that period?
He was a very shy, very introspective character. Pleasant, sweet man with a lot of natural enthusiasm, which he has now, but has always remained very shy. And he's no good for talk shows whatsoever. So we tried to get him a gallery, and in the interval I invited collectors, the so-called the pioneer collectors, there are 8 or 10 of them, to his studio. And they purchased his works at prices between $250, $350 for large works and $65 to $75 for those little soup can pictures, which he used to do by hand. He sold a number of works that way, until finally the Stable Gallery, which had moved, gave him a show on 74th Street. It was his first show of the boxes of Brillo boxes and soap boxes, so forth. By that time already, he was a secret source of possible power in the art world. I mean, his name circulated very rapidly through the fashion press for some reason. Anyhow, things progressed like that. I met James Rosenquist in a fish restaurant downtown. It's still there. It's called, it's a dreadful restaurant, really. I don't want to announce it here. And he came to my table and said, you're the man that saves the old stones from the buildings, aren't you? You didn't announce that credential
We're going
to the crowd here.
to certainly make a point of that. Perhaps you
And
can
I said,
inquire
yes,
more.
I save old stones. Do you have some? He said, I have 5 masterworks from a building that I just assaulted, and you can come and see them. So I went to see the old stones, but it turned out to be an artist studio, and this was a device to get me there. He could have asked me very bluntly to visit his studio, but he got me there to see the old stones. But he had terrible old stones, really, very poor examples, and he had very good pictures. And
He was still a sign painter.
he was
at that point.
doing sign painting for a
Billboards.
living, but he had his first paintings were there, these enormous sign-like paintings.
What about the scale of the work, let alone the subject matter?
Well, in the case of Lichtenstein and Warhol, the scale was at that point not larger than Pollock's large pictures. But Rosenquist's were larger. They were mural scaled. And that was unsettling for any art dealer with a 25 by 25 foot room.
When he had 68-foot murals.
They were very big pictures. Anyhow, I believed from the evidence I had that Castelli would not be interested in this artist because, again, he was part of the same concern, the same ideology of common images. And so I invited Dick Bellamy, who had been fired already from the Martha Jackson Gallery, and who I had gotten to a man named Robert Scull as the director of the so-called Green Gallery. That itself is a very elaborate tale. So Bellamy was looking for work, and he came up to Rosenquist's studio, and he affiliated him at once for the Green Gallery. And these 3 artists showed at just about the same time in New York. Rosenquist and Lichtenstein and Wesselman showed at another gallery downtown at that time.
Ergo a movement.
It happened, yes, it happened just about, I think, November 1961. And the antagonism to this was ferocious by all the artists in the Castelli Gallery, from all the artists around town, from the established critics, from all the dealers. The venom and hostility against this development was really untoward. It was ferocious. It was unseemly. It was rude, you know, and it went on for several years, and we witnessed this every time a new movement develops, generates. Anyhow, all during those years at the Castelli Gallery, the gallery didn't really achieve any real commercial momentum till about 1966, 1967.
And what happened then?
Well, at that point, we already had Johns and Rauschenberg and Lichtenstein and Warhol and Frank Stella, and it was a resistible tide. And we were identified, I think, first by the European audience. You know, other cultures frequently become more involved in alien cultures first, as the Americans did with Impressionist painting. The Europeans and the Germans and the Italians were the first to respond to the pop art movement, and that gained very grand momentum about 1965, 1966. And the gallery finally achieved a measure of solvency. Up to that point, there had been a collection in the Castelli family of Pollocks, Kleins, de Koonings, Gorkys, and Dubuffets, and the gallery's solvency was dependent on the resale of those pictures, you know. And other works came in from illustrious collectors for resale. And the gallery, of course, made commissions on these resales, and that's basically how it survived, because it really didn't make a profit or even a solvency by its new artists till about 1966.
There is hardly an artist who came here during the course of these sessions who has not commented on Leo's generosity. Did he really find an artist and underwrite them for extended periods of time?
He's always done that. I mean, during beginning about 1966, each of the artists in the gallery who are considered affiliated regular exhibitors have received monthly stipends. And he's done this. He did this without certainly the foreknowledge of the future career of these artists. That is on definite faith in the artist's capacity to do work. In many instances, it didn't work out, and he continued to support those artists whose careers did not flower and develop into anything illustrious. You know, I know for sure that during the interval that I was there, that 3/4 of the artists in the gallery were not selling work who were on full stipend, monthly stipend. That means anywhere between $750 and $2,500 a month. So that in order to sustain that, a lot of work had to be turned over. And fortunately, at that point, Lichtenstein and Stella was selling a lot of work. And of course, Johns was also, but very few works came into the gallery.
That may have been your role model, because we're about to come to the O.K. Harris Gallery, and from what I understand, 75 to 80% of the work that you show is not ultimately sold. But your faith in those artists, I guess, sustains your showing it. Along about, I guess, 1969, for whatever the series of reasons, and perhaps you'll tell us, you chose to leave the Castelli Gallery. And the first gallery that had opened, I guess, in Soho was Paula Cooper, who pioneered in about 1968. It wasn't soon long thereafter that you moved to Soho and opened the O.K. Harris Gallery. Can you tell us what gave you the impetus to do that, and who is O.K. Harris?
Castelli Gallery had achieved by late 1968, a large measure of international fame, and the gallery was actually beginning to flourish. At that point, those artists who were showing on a regular basis became rather powerful. There also, at that point, it was Donald Judd and Robert Morris. And as I say, Stella and Lichtenstein and Warhol were selling very well. Jasper Johns was already American world mythology at that point. We sold everything of these artists that came into the gallery. And it did not seem that it was possible at that point to further inquire into the condition of new talent in America. Whereas the gallery was set. It had its regular exhibiting artists, and though I continued on a regular daily basis to look at work, Castelli no longer had the strength, the energy, the capacity, or maybe even the will to go out with me on Saturday morning to look at studios. So part of my own instinct to a creative venture in the arts was diminished, and I felt that I, in my youthful energy, was not fulfilling my destiny in being in that gallery, which had established its fame and credentials. And so when another artist was going to be brought to the gallery who had already achieved fame, I didn't think that this was creative adventure, and I announced my departure. At that juncture, this was in late 1968, I had no ambition to become a private dealer. I was a private art gallery. I was involved in writing fiction, and I thought perhaps that I would hide myself away and try to do something important in that area. But it was discovered very quickly, as it is in the art world, which is a very tiny, very intimate community, that I was leaving the gallery. It was within 3 hours of my announcement that 8 people solicited my assistance in opening galleries, and I was offered fabulous sums of money to open a premises on 57th Street. But each of the offers was for some involvement on the part of the backer. And with my fabulous sense of independence, this did not seem attractive to me. But on the 9th offer was very attractive. There was a wonderful man who's well known in the art world as the most generous benefactor. And he said, Ivan, you open a gallery anywhere you want, and I'll help you out as best I can, and you pay me back when it's convenient for you.
Can you tell us who that is? Which is a very nice phrase.
What's that?
Can you tell us who that is?
It's Sidney Lewis of Richmond, Virginia. He's a man who's very much involved still in collecting and contributing to the welfare of the art world. There are other fine people like that, but this was the most attractive offer that I'd received by a very gentle, generous man. And the flowering of my vision as a private dealer, as a gallery operator, came into being at that moment. But I decided that it wouldn't be somehow feasible within my nature and within my radical personality to do the same thing that everybody else did. And I said, well, I'm going to open a gallery. It's going to be somewhat different than those that I knew. And I was already living at that time in a loft in Lower Manhattan. And I had been visiting, as I said, regularly the Soho district, looking at artist studios. The area was physically very attractive. It has an architectural unity, as you would know as well as anybody. And the rents were very, very cheap for very big spaces. And the art that we were seeing was becoming increasingly larger. So much so that we had to, in many instances, go through rigging operations to bring the works into the Castelli Gallery, becoming heavier and larger all the time. So that I thought if I would open a gallery, it would be in this fresh new district. In the Soho district, was then at that time not named. And I sought about for a space, and I found a 7,000 square foot space for which the rent was $900. 7,000 square feet for $900. And I thought that, well, 7,000 square feet was really museum space and that I couldn't possibly deal with space that large. So I offered it to Mrs. Zonnebend. And she thought that 3,500 square feet was much too large for a functioning commercial gallery, and she rejected it. So as an act of brutal daring, I took the entire space. I had a fund of $50,000 to work with. The gallery cost me $46,000 to build. $46,000. It was a raw factory. It was in a state of total decay. It had been a toy factory, and it was almost totally demolished. And I started from the beginning with that space. It cost $46,000. I had $4,000 in the bank on the day that I opened, which was in October 1969. And the reason I came down there again is not because anybody invited me to go down there. I had never really heard of the Paula Cooper Gallery. It was a pure adventure. But I had made certain friends in the art world, and I knew that if I showed daring, dangerous, threatening, remarkable art, that somebody would come to look at it. But I walked out, I remember, on that Saturday morning in October, and fortunately it was a sunshiny day. And I went out with my broom to sweep the street because my father said, there's no greater pride than sweeping your own sidewalk. Because he had never had a sidewalk to sweep.
And what was the first exhibition?
We had 5 abstractionists and 1 realist. These were the artists that I had accumulated in that little drawer at Castelli Gallery over the years. In that drawer also, fortunately, were slides by Dwayne Hansen, John DeAndrea,
Both
Ralph
of whom
Goings.
had their first
They had their first shows
exhibitions
with
at
me.
OK Harris.
Yeah, in other words, that was my reservoir of artists to show, because I didn't have the funds to invite well-known artists. I couldn't afford to give stipends with my $4,000 in the bank to give stipends to artists, so my plan was to show brand new talent. And the artists that I showed in the beginning were never shown before, except maybe in group shows or invitationals here and there. And of the 6 artists I showed my first show, only one is still active, which I suppose proves something. You know, that either they didn't develop the vibrant powers of creation that I'd hoped for, or else that I failed them in some way.
How did you arrive at the name OK Harris? What did that signify?
If you really want the story, there's fabulous vignettes and stories for all of the questions you're asking me, and of course they're worthy of special sessions. The naming of the OK Harris Gallery came about because Robert Scull decided that he wanted to open an art gallery anonymously, as if he could do anything anonymously, and that he wanted a manager and he wanted a name. I offered him as a manager Dick Bellamy, who was free for the offering. He had just been fired from the Martha Jackson Gallery for putting on that terrible show of Oldenburg and Dine. And we had to come up with a name, and I sat down with Dick Bellamy and we went through 3,000 names that we might be able to use. And they were all charming, exquisite names, but we paired them all away, and I came up with a name. I said, this has got to be the name of a person, this gallery, because if you have a person's name on the gallery, you can blame everything that you do wrong on that person. You say, I'm only the caretaker or the manager or the director, but basically the final decisions are made by Mr. Harris. So I came up with the name OK Harris because it had a kind of resonance of a fast-talking, energetic, lively, gambling-style American, you know, what they call a Mississippi gambler. And it sounded just right for me for an art gallery, and Bellamy agreed this was the name of the gallery. We presented this to Mr. Scull, and he immediately rejected it as uncouth. And so Bellamy, as an act of revenge, decided that he would name the gallery after a certain kind of slime, right? And he said, what oozes? He says, what's really slimy? He says, I see green in my eyes. Green. He says, the Green Gallery. He said, well, Mr. Scull immediately accepted it as a dignified name for somebody. But Bellamy had meant it to be a kind of ooze. He always told me that. Anyhow, that's how OK Harris got its name. Anyhow, it wasn't accepted by that gallery, so I took it for myself. And that's how it came about. And we have a portrait in my office, you may have noticed, of a bearded man. And it says, Oscar Klondike Harris, 1789, 1969. On there. And we still blame things on him, though allegedly he's dead.
Other than that one, what makes a work of art qualify for your gallery?
What you gain after looking at things with the kind of intensity and passion that I do is you gain conviction of your perceptions. That is, you see so much, you need so much to see, you know. You have such an incredible appetite to look at things that you learn how to look at them. It's like learning how to taste good food and wine. And it can come about that in looking at them, if you have professional use for these things, in other words, you can be perceptive in the visual arts and never put it to use and never test yourself. You test yourself as a collector, test yourself maybe as an art historian, as a critic, but the fiercest kind of test would be to be an art dealer, because the things that you select as worthy of your contemplation, you put up for other people to look at, so you're constantly challenged. And that test came about in the early years, working first with the Hansa Gallery, and then with Martha Jackson, where I had very few choices, and then certainly at Castelli Gallery, where during the early years, of course, we participated in selecting the artists to be shown, and one gained the confidence of one's conviction that way. There is no other method. There are no scientific devices that one can employ to detect vitality in art. The only method is one's confidence in one's visual perception.
What are your priorities for viewing work? You mentioned that you saw slides of 20 or 30 artists a week at an earlier period. You still have the time to do that. How does a young artist get access to you?
We see upwards of 100 artists a week in the last 2 years. It's been increasing as the awareness of the importance of American art in the world cultural community has grown. The idea of the legitimacy of a person pursuing a career in the arts has grown, so that art schools, of course, have flourished and grown, and the number of applicants from all over the country has grown so overwhelmingly that it's almost impossible to receive them all. We've made it a program to look at every artist that applies to us. We don't solicit their visit, but they come in regularly with their slides and photographs to see us at the gallery, and we receive every applicant at the time of his or her arrival.
That must be increasingly frustrating, both to you and to the applicant, because in spite of the fact and it is a very generous act to see the work of so many artists. Are there more than 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 new artists that you could possibly show each year at your gallery?
Well, we had, to begin with, of course, this enormous space, and we're able to do 4 shows at once. And our philosophical principle was to try to exhibit the broadest possible spectrum of the most adventurous art being offered. I don't have a narrow view on what's good in art. I like romanticism, and I like realism, and I like conceptualism, and I enjoy photography and sculpture, so we show a very broad range of works there. And we've been, of course, accused of being a kind of supermarket of the arts because we are so broad-minded.
Isn't that what you had in mind?
No, I didn't have a supermarket principle in mind, and I object to the term, but I like the idea of a museum spectrum. I like the idea that I might be able to encompass the prevailing temperaments of our particular moment. It is fatiguing, it's exhausting, and it's frustrating to see very good talent that I have to reject from day to day. And we do see during the course of a week any number of artists who qualify to be exhibited on a professional level, and they need be rejected. We can't give advice. Other dealers resent the idea of your sending them for a visit, you know. So we give them some clues if we can about about dealers who might be responsive on some level to their ideology without suggesting anybody succinctly.
How many new artists can you show a year?
We put on 44 separate exhibits a season, which is more than any arts institution in the country. And it's hard work. It takes tremendous expertise, which we have, a lot of finesse, and a lot of diplomatic skills.
And how many of them are new annually?
We affiliated 2 artists out of 5,000 applicants last year. 5,000 applicants. Now, of course, some artists have one great moment.
With all this quantity, how much quality do you see?
At my gallery, you see very even quality from month to month. As I say, you don't need to have qualifications to be an art dealer. Anybody can embark on it.
You had 5,000 applicants during the course of the year.
Yes, 5,000 applicants. For the most part, those who would sort themselves out sufficiently to come into the Soho district and to walk into our imperious space and to face the legendary characters down there. They're brave enough to do that. For the most part, they're professional artists. They come from all over the country. They do not represent a particular regional style. Regional styles seem to be finished. It's the American school. And we see
But there are
very
regional
good
differences in taste. Would
Yes,
you
there
not
might have been. I don't see that so much anymore, but I know that in Texas they still buy Western art, so-called, a lot of it, you know, and that advanced...
Well, don't you find the East Coast more knowing, perhaps the California more experimental?
No, I don't find that to be the case. Not among the artists that come in to see me. I see good experimentation from everywhere. We see, as I say, up to 100 artists a week, of which 90% are totally professional, of which 50% could be shown in some professional setting, of which 8 or 10 are as good as the artists that I'm showing in my gallery right now. It's very painful, very frustrating, and I have no place to send them.
How do you decide the market value of a work of art? There's always been much talk that prices are arrived at not necessarily as a result of free market conditions or forces alone, but there is talk of collusion, often of placing of works of art, rather than merely selling works of art. How much price manipulation has and still does go on?
Those of us who've been in the art community for as long as I have, over 20 years, have been seeking a meaningful conspiracy for that entire time, and we simply cannot find one. There are little murky doings in the arts and a certain amount of disruptive
Little murky
elements.
doings?
Yeah, little minor conspiracies, but it never develops into anything really significant, you know? And it's a shame because most communities have these conspiracies, and we just can't formulate one. You price a work of art based on your instinct about it. A work that's 4x5, painted on canvas, is $650 in the first show.
So there is a going rate,
right?
Based on size and first show.
Yeah, I think
the price has some relevance to...
Yeah. I mean, you took 10 art dealers who dealt exclusively with works of living artists, and you said, how much is a picture that size of that type for the first show? It's $650 to $900. That's what it is.
And the second show?
The second show is $1,200 to $1,500.
And when does that giant
then something
leap
peculiar
forward?
happens after that. It could happen.
Or else they don't have a third show.
Well, that's right. Well, you know, it's progressive, and I say in my gallery, I know that's our guiding principle, that we don't raise the price of an artist's work unless there's between 5 and 10 collectors willing to pay that price. You know, what happened during the emergence of the so-called hyperrealist movement was that, again, as with the pop art movement, it was accepted first in Europe and mostly in Germany before here. And a number of my artists who were selling at that time for $4,000 or $5,000 sold at auction in Germany for $15,000 to $20,000. These were paintings that we had priced legitimately at $5,000. We're selling at auction $15,000 to $20,000. Any conspiratorial instinct would immediately price the works in the gallery at those high prices. But it's futile and senseless because there's no depth to the market. So you must test the depth of the market with the number of collectors willing to pay a particular price, and that's the time that you raise the price. It's a very instinctual process. You know, you do it somehow and say, it should be higher. Picture comes in, the artist has achieved a certain major reputation or fame. You look at the work and say, it's a beauty, it's grand, it's an invention. It should be $7,500. Last year it was $6,000. It feels like $7,500. And that's how it's arrived at. And I think most art dealers have that instinct. Most collectors do, certainly.
You've criticized the art critics for making artists into media heroes, inflating their importance.
When did I do that?
In a speech you made at RISD and Brown at great length. And actually more than once, I think, Ivan. What do you think, and we'll give you an opportunity to correct that, what do you think of the role of the critic? Is it a necessary one? Is it a useful one? Do standards exist, or is art in the eye of the beholder?
It's commonly held that a group of critics could get together in a seemly back room and agree that a certain artist might be of major virtue and that they should support him or her. Or that critics might, or that dealers might do the same thing, agree that a certain artist, German dealer, Japanese dealer, American dealer, one on the West Coast, come together at a fanciful dinner and say, this is the artist we're going to launch.
Fanciful.
But it just simply doesn't work that way, because the confrontation with the collector and the museum official and all the sharp characters who come in who don't collect or do anything like that, that's the final testing ground, that's the proving ground. So that a conspiracy to launch an artist of no virtue is a failure to begin with. Now with the critics, the role for me is a significant one. The critic's role and responsibility is probably to try to sort out for us the meaningful creative ventures of our time. Try to identify those artists of consequence and try to deflate those artists who've achieved major reputation for no proper reason. And unfortunately, that's not frequently done. Critics are a very special breed. They're not well paid. There are very few of them who are capable of writing significant prose. They all know each other. They're fearful of their reputations with each other. They're concerned about their place in the art world. They're anxious not to hurt any fragile, creative person. All of these forces are working on them. So it's very hard to go into a first show of an artist and say, this show should not have happened. Or so-and-so, whose prices are now between $30,000 and $40,000 a painting, should never have achieved a show in a little co-op on Delancey Street. It's a hard thing to say, but it should be said. It should be said. It's the role of the critic to sort out for us those things which have not achieved proper measure of fame, or those things which are acclaimed overwhelmingly and don't deserve it.
How important is a dealer to the work of an artist?
I always believed, and I say this with great humbleness and with great pomposity at the same time, that a great artist will be discovered anyhow in our time. 19th century, people like Van Gogh went unnoticed. But I think with the communications as they are now, with the number of people like yourself willing to look at everything and give it a chance, that no artist who reaches out a little bit, who is worthy of it, will go unnoticed. I think that Warhol will have been discovered without me, that it is possible that Lichtenstein might have abandoned his cartoon style if during the first year he did it, it was not acclaimed. Something like that is possible, because he was showing at a gallery.
He also had the support of that Happenings group in Rutgers, and that helped a lot, that critical mass.
There was an atmosphere to support this development, you know. And I think that it can be an element in the development of an artist's career. I know that sometimes an artist suddenly flushes with creative energy because he or she achieves a first show. It suddenly expands into some wondrous kind of creative fertility, while at other times an exhibition can ruin an artist's career. The confrontation with the work, the exhaustion of the public reaction to it sometimes absolutely demoralizes an artist.
What about, as you talk about emerging artists, what about the role of women artists?
There's no separate role for women artists. There never has been for me. To create a separate world for women artists for me is absolutely a debasement of the natural wholesomeness of the art world. In the very first days that I was in the art world, we looked at women's art and men's art with absolutely no prejudice. The aspiration of the art dealer is to show the best work in the world. We don't show people, we show art objects. Some of my artists are totally disagreeable people. Some of them are outright obnoxious, egotistical, nasty, ambitious creeps. And we show their work anyhow. And some of them are women, and some are men, and some are homosexuals, and there are other diverse types there also. And I don't know of any art dealer except Martha Jackson who didn't like women because she had a terrible argument with Louise Nevelson. She said, I'll never show another woman artist again. Louise is a ferocious force. And she also antagonized Sidney Janis. He doesn't want to show he has Marisol, but I think it's the only woman artist he has. So there's the only two instances that I know of where...
exhibitions that you've had, how many of them were
In the beginning, in our first year, we only had 2 women artists. I think we have almost 40% at this point, because the number of applications by women has increased immensely. If you have any conscience and any integrity, and you're really caught up in it, you're going to put on the best shows you can find, and you're going to stumble occasionally, as we do. I know that every one of our shows is of a high professional standard, but sometimes they're really not quite as dangerous as I hope they would be.
Thank you, Ivan Karp, for your startling insights, your wide-ranging and often poetic opinions. Thank you for being with us, and thank you, class staff.